If you are lost, you picked a strange place to stop. The voice came from somewhere behind the weathered barn, and for one embarrassing second, I wondered whether the abandoned farm had just spoken to me. I lowered my camera and followed the sound. That was when I saw him. A tall man in a white beekeeper jacket stood between two long rows of wooden hives, his hood folded behind his shoulders. He looked completely at home in a place that looked as though everyone else had left 20 years ago. "I'm not lost," I said. He glanced toward my rental SUV parked beside the gravel road. "You are 6 miles from the highway, standing in my field with a camera." Temporarily misdirected. His mouth almost became a smile. "That sounds more expensive." The rain had started 30 minutes earlier while I was driving through rural Wisconsin, turning a photography road trip into a search for somewhere safe to wait out the weather. I was 30 years old, lived in Chicago when I bothered staying there, and made most of my income photographing places other people wanted to visit. Arizona deserts, Maine coastlines, Colorado mountain towns. My camera had seen more of America than most people I knew. Somehow, that afternoon, a wrong turn had brought me to the most interesting place I had seen in months. The farmhouse stood beyond the barn, 2 stories of faded white siding beneath a dark roof. Tall grass surrounded the porch. Several windows were covered from inside. Nothing suggested anyone lived there. The beehives were the opposite. They were painted, maintained, and arranged carefully beside a field of wildflowers. "Those are yours?" I asked. "Unless the bees have started paying property taxes." "I meant the hives." "I know." He walked toward me and extended a hand. "Grant Walker. Dylan Carter." His handshake was brief and firm. Up close, Grant looked to be in his early 30s, with brown hair, pale blue-gray eyes, and the kind of calm expression that made me feel as though I was the only person in the conversation who had arrived without instructions. "Photographer?" he asked. I lifted the camera slightly. "That obvious?" "Either that, or you carry very expensive binoculars." I looked toward the hives. "Can I take a few pictures?" Grant's expression changed immediately. Not angry, guarded. "Of the bees. The farm. The hives. Whatever you are comfortable with." "Not me." "That is fine." He studied me for another moment before nodding toward the field. "Stay on this side of the fence. Do not walk directly in front of the hive entrances." "Understood. And if one comes near you, do not wave your arms around." I was planning to behave with tremendous dignity. That almost smile returned. I spent the next 15 minutes photographing the contrast that had caught me immediately. Neglected buildings behind carefully maintained hives, wild grass beside neat rows of wooden boxes, dark storm clouds over yellow flowers. Every few minutes, I noticed Grant working in the background. He moved slowly around the bees, checking frames and making notes on a small clipboard. There was nothing lonely about the way he worked, but there was something solitary about it. When the rain strengthened, Grant pointed toward the barn. "You should get under cover." We stood beneath the overhang while water swept across the field. "Does anyone actually live here?" I asked. Grant looked toward the farmhouse. The question seemed simple until I saw his face. "Depends what you mean by live." I waited for more. None came. "That sounds mysterious." "It is not." "You realize saying that makes it sound significantly more mysterious." Grant folded his arms. "The farmhouse has been empty for years. But you are here." "I stay in the cabin behind the barn." I had not noticed it through the trees. "And you maintain all of this yourself?" "Mostly." "Why?" His eyes moved toward the hives. "Because they still need someone." There was something about the answer that made me stop searching for a clever response. The rain began easing. I checked the road, knowing I should leave before another storm moved through. Grant stepped away from the barn. "Highway is east from the mailbox. Keep right at the first fork." So I was lost. Temporarily misdirected. I laughed. "Thanks for letting me shoot." Grant nodded. I started toward my SUV, then turned back. "Would you mind if I came back tomorrow? The light should be better." He hesitated long enough that I expected a refusal. "You can photograph the hives." "Still not you. Still not me." "Fair enough." I climbed into the SUV and looked once more through the windshield. Grant had already returned to the bees. Behind him stood an empty farmhouse. In front of him, thousands of living things moved through the wildflowers. I had traveled hundreds of miles looking for something worth photographing, and somehow the first place that made me want to stop was a farm everyone else seemed to have abandoned. The next morning, I drove back to the farm before I could talk myself into continuing north. My original plan had been to photograph small towns along Lake Superior, which sounded responsible when I looked at the route on my laptop. Instead, I checked out of my motel for exactly one night, paid for another, and followed the same narrow county road toward Grant Walker and his bees. Grant was already working when I arrived. He wore faded jeans, work boots, and a light gray shirt with the sleeves pushed to his forearms. His beekeeper jacket hung from a fence post nearby. He watched me park, then glanced at his watch. "You are early. Photographers call this good light. Farmers call it 7 in the morning." I brought coffee. I held up 2 paper cups. Grant considered that. "That improves your argument." I handed him one. Black. His eyebrows lifted. "Lucky guess. You do not look like a caramel latte person." I'm not sure whether that is a compliment. We walked toward the hives while the morning sun spread across the wildflowers. The place looked completely different without yesterday's storm. Golden light touched the old barn, and bees moved steadily between white clover, asters, and patches of yellow flowers I could not name. I raised my camera. Grant immediately stepped aside. "Still no pictures of you?" I asked. That was the agreement. I remember. For the next hour, I photographed everything except him. Hive entrances, bees landing on flowers, weathered fence posts. The farmhouse reflected in a shallow puddle. Grant's hands occasionally entered the edge of a frame, but I respected the boundary. Eventually, he noticed me watching while he opened one of the hives. "You want to see?" "From here, preferably." "You drove back 6 miles from the highway to photograph bees, but you are afraid to stand near them?" "I respect their numerical advantage." Grant laughed, the first real laugh I had heard from him. He handed me a spare veil. "Put this on." That sentence usually comes before a bad decision. "Stand beside me and move slowly." I followed him toward the hive. The sound grew louder, not threatening, just constant, like the air itself had developed a motor. My instincts told me to keep moving. Grant noticed. "Stand still." There are approximately 10,000 reasons not to. More than that. That is extremely unhelpful. He smiled. "They are working. Let them work." I forced myself to stop. A bee passed close to my shoulder, and I resisted the urge to move away. Grant lifted a frame carefully and showed me the patterned surface. "That is honey. Some of it. There is brood here too." He explained the structure of the colony in simple terms, pointing out things I would never have noticed through a camera lens. For once, I forgot to take pictures. When we finished, we sat on the farmhouse porch with the remains of our coffee. Grant disappeared into the cabin and returned with a small jar of amber honey. "Yesterday's visitor fee," he said, handing it to me. "I thought admission was free. You complained a lot." I provided conversation. "Exactly." I turned the jar in the sunlight. "Do you sell this?" "Farmers markets. A couple of stores. Enough to keep things going." "Things meaning the bees?" Grant looked across the property. "Mostly." I followed his gaze to the farmhouse. One porch step sagged slightly. Paint peeled from the railing. Curtains covered several windows from inside. "You really never stay in there?" "Not anymore." "Why keep it?" Grant took a slow drink of coffee. "You ask a lot of questions." "Occupational habit." "Photography requires interrogation." "Good photography requires understanding what you are looking at." Grant looked at me then, and something guarded returned to his expression. "Maybe you do. Not need to understand everything you photograph." I knew enough to stop. "Fair." He relaxed slightly. My phone buzzed with an email from a client asking when I would reach Minnesota. I stared at the message, then locked the screen without answering. Grant noticed. "Work? Eventually. You travel all the time?" "Pretty much." "Sounds exhausting." "Most people say it sounds exciting." Those things can both be true. The observation landed more accurately than I wanted. My laptop held photographs from 23 states. My Chicago apartment contained more packed bags than furniture I cared about. I had spent years telling people movement was freedom because that sounded better than admitting I never stayed anywhere long enough to miss it. I stood and picked up my camera. "I should go." Grant nodded. "Thanks for the coffee." "Thanks for the honey." I walked toward my SUV, then heard him call my name. I turned. "If you come back tomorrow," Grant said. "The light hits the west hives around 6:30. I smiled. Was that an invitation? Photography advice? Of course. I drove away with a jar of honey on the passenger seat and Minnesota waiting somewhere north. By the time I reached the highway, I already knew I would be back at 6:30. By the third morning, Grant stopped asking whether I planned to come back. He simply placed a second coffee mug on the porch railing before I arrived, and somehow that felt more personal than an invitation. I had extended my motel reservation again, and finally emailed my client to say Minnesota would have to wait a few days. I told myself the farm was becoming a stronger photo series than anything on my original route. That was true. It was simply not the entire truth. "You are late," Grant said when I crossed the yard. I checked my phone. It is 6:32. Bees respect punctuality. Do they wear watches? Tiny ones. Very expensive. I laughed and set my camera bag beside the porch. Over the next several days, our routine formed without either of us discussing it. I photographed the hives in the morning light. Grant checked frames, repaired wooden boxes, and explained things I had never expected to care about. By 9, we usually ended up on the porch with coffee. Sometimes I brought breakfast sandwiches from town. Once Grant gave me honey on warm toast and looked personally offended when I said it might be better than anything I had eaten in Chicago that month. "Your standards are concerning," he said. "My standards are excellent. You ate dinner from a gas station Tuesday. You were not supposed to know that. You left the receipt in your car." The strange thing was how quickly silence became comfortable around him. My normal life was built around movement. Airports, rental cars, hotel elevators, unfamiliar streets. Even when I was home, I usually had music playing or a television on because quiet made me feel as though I should be somewhere else. Grant seemed to have no such problem. He could spend 10 minutes watching bees move through clover without needing to fill the space with words. One afternoon, he handed me a spare veil and nodded toward the west hives. "You are helping today." I thought I was documenting. "You have taken 400 photographs of me not being in photographs. You can hold a box." That sounds suspiciously like unpaid labor. "I gave you honey. That was days ago." Grant smiled. "Stand still." I followed him into the field. By then, the sound of thousands of bees no longer made every muscle in my body tense. A few moved around my shoulders as Grant opened a hive. "You are getting better," he said. "At beekeeping?" "At not panicking." I was never panicking. A bee landed on my sleeve. I immediately stopped breathing. Grant glanced at it. "Dylan, I am standing still. You are also turning blue." I exhaled. Grant held out his hand near my arm, waiting until the bee moved away on its own. "See, I handled that beautifully. You survived standing in a field. Put it on my resume." He laughed, and I found myself watching him instead of reaching for my camera. Grant looked different when he forgot to guard himself. Younger somehow. Lighter. Then he noticed me looking, and the familiar reserve returned. I turned toward the farmhouse. "You ever think about fixing that place up?" Grant followed my gaze. "Sometimes. It has good bones. You have been watching renovation shows at your motel. The television options are limited. That explains a lot. Seriously. The porch, those windows, the view. It could be incredible." Grant's expression became distant. "It was once." The answer ended the conversation. That evening, clouds gathered while we carried empty hive boxes into the barn. The wind picked up suddenly, sending leaves across the yard. Grant looked toward the sky. "Storm is coming faster than they predicted. Should I head back?" He checked the road. "Not yet. Wait until it passes." Thunder rolled somewhere beyond the fields. Grant secured the barn doors while I moved my camera equipment away from the entrance. Then the lights in the cabin flickered and went dark. "Power is out," I said. I noticed. Grant searched a shelf for a flashlight, found one, and tested it. "I need lanterns from the house." I looked toward the farmhouse. The empty house. It still has supplies. Rain began hitting the barn roof. Grant crossed the yard, and I followed him onto the farmhouse porch. He unlocked the front door. The air inside smelled like old wood and closed rooms. His flashlight moved across covered furniture, framed family photographs, a dusty piano, and shelves that looked untouched for years. It did not feel abandoned. It felt paused. Grant found 2 lanterns in a kitchen cabinet. As he turned back, my eyes followed the hallway. Every interior door stood open except one at the far end. That door was closed with a small brass lock beneath the handle. Grant noticed where I was looking. The ease disappeared from his face. "Do not ask about that room." I looked at him. I was not going to. "You were." Rain struck the windows harder. Grant handed me a lantern and walked toward the front door. I followed without another question, but something had changed. For days, he had taught me that bees were easier to understand when I stopped moving long enough to observe them. Standing inside that silent farmhouse, I realized the same might be true of Grant. And for the first time, I understood that he was not simply living alone on an old farm. He was staying beside something he still could not bring himself to open. The next morning, Grant was already waiting beside the west hives when I arrived, but there was no second coffee on the porch railing. I noticed that before I noticed anything else. "Morning," I said. "Morning." He kept his attention on a wooden frame in his hands. The storm had washed the sky clean, leaving the farm bright and almost impossibly green. Everything should have felt lighter. Instead, the silence between us had changed. "I did not ask about the room," I said eventually. Grant glanced at me. "I know. I am also not going to." "Good. But you should know that saying do not ask about something is basically the fastest way to make a photographer curious." One corner of his mouth moved. "Then consider it professional development." That was enough to tell me I had not completely ruined whatever friendship we were building. I raised my camera and returned to work. For the next hour, I photographed bees moving through wet clover while Grant checked the hives. I kept my promise. No questions about the farmhouse. No questions about the locked door. When we finished, Grant surprised me by nodding toward his cabin. "Coffee. I thought I had lost coffee privileges." "You are dramatic before breakfast." The cabin was smaller than I expected. One main room held a narrow kitchen, a worn couch, a table covered with beekeeping journals, and shelves filled with books. A bedroom sat behind a half-open door. Everything was clean and practical. Nothing looked permanent. I noticed a framed photograph on the shelf. Grant stood between two older men beside the farmhouse porch, all three smiling. I looked away before he caught me studying it. He caught me anyway. "My father and my brother," he said. "You do not have to explain." Grant poured coffee into two mismatched mugs. "My brother lives in Oregon now. Has for years." "And your father?" Grant paused. "He passed away 5 years ago." "I am sorry." "Thank you." He handed me a mug and sat across from me. For several seconds, only the refrigerator made noise. "This was his farm," Grant said. "His and my mother's before she passed. My brother wanted to sell after Dad was gone." "You did not?" "No." "Because of the bees?" Grant looked toward the window. "Partly." I waited. The old version of me would have filled the silence. Grant had apparently trained that instinct out of me in less than a week. "Dad started keeping bees when I was 12, he continued. "At first there were 2 hives behind the barn. Then 6. Then 12. He kept saying he was going to slow down." "Did he?" "Never." Grant smiled faintly. "He taught me everything. How to read a colony. When to leave them alone. How to notice a problem before it became one." "Stand still," I asked. His eyes met mine. "That too." Something about the answer felt heavier now. "So you stayed?" I stayed. 5 years. 5 years. I looked around the small cabin, suddenly understanding why it had never felt like a home. And the farmhouse. Grant's expression tightened, but he did not shut down this time. "Too many memories." "That makes sense." "Does it? More than you think." He studied me. "What are you running from, Dylan?" The question caught me completely off guard. "Who says I am running? You have been here almost a week. You were supposed to be in Minnesota days ago. You travel for work, but every time you talk about Chicago, you call it your apartment, never home." I stared into my coffee. "You notice too much. Occupational habit. That is my line. I improved it." I laughed quietly, but the question remained. "Maybe I just like leaving," I said. "That is not the same as having somewhere you want to return to." I looked at him. Grant seemed to realize he had said more than he intended. He stood and carried his mug to the sink. "I should check the south field." "Grant." He stopped. "You do not have to tell me what is behind that door." "I know. And I am not going to photograph anything you do not want photographed." He turned toward me. "I know that too." That afternoon, we repaired hive boxes in the barn. The conversation became easier again. Grant told me which flowers produced his favorite honey. I told him about accidentally spending a night in a roadside motel in Nevada where the air conditioner sounded like farm equipment. By sunset, the tension from the morning had almost disappeared. I was packing my camera when Grant walked toward the farmhouse. He stopped at the porch and looked back. "Dylan." "Yeah." "Come here." I followed him inside. Evening light stretched through the dusty hallway. Grant stood in front of the locked door with a small brass key in his hand. "You said I did not have to tell you." "You do not." "I know." He inserted the key into the lock. For several seconds, he did nothing. Then he turned it. The lock clicked. Grant rested his hand on the doorknob and looked at me. My father closed this room 3 weeks before he died, he said. I have opened it twice since. He pushed the door inward, and as the fading sunlight entered the room, I realized Grant had not brought me there because I had discovered his secret. He had brought me there because, for the first time in years, he had decided not to carry it alone. The room smelled faintly of cedar, dust, and old paper. Grant stepped inside first and opened the curtains, letting the last amber light of evening spread across a long wooden workbench. I had expected something dramatic behind the locked door. Instead, I found unfinished hive boxes stacked against one wall, hand tools arranged above the bench, shelves filled with notebooks, and dozens of small envelopes labeled with the names of wildflowers. A large map of the farm covered nearly half the opposite wall. Colored pencil marks crossed fields, tree lines, and sections of creek bed. This was your father's workshop, I said. Grant nodded. He spent more time in here than anywhere else. I moved carefully, keeping my camera hanging untouched at my side. What are the envelopes? Seeds. Some are probably too old now. Grant picked up one labeled wild bergamot. Dad collected native flower seeds from around the county. He wanted to replace some of the crop fields with pollinator habitat. I looked at the map again. Areas were shaded in yellow, blue, and green. Small handwritten notes identified flowering seasons and possible hive locations. He planned all of this. For years. Grant opened one of the notebooks. The pages were filled with sketches, planting schedules, observations about bees, and calculations written in narrow handwriting. He wanted the farm to become more than a place that produced something people could sell. He wanted it to become a place that protected something. Did he ever start? A little. The west field you have been photographing was the first section. That explained why the wildflowers there seemed almost too perfectly varied to be accidental. Then he got sick, Grant continued. Plans became appointments. Projects became things we would do later. He closed the notebook gently. Later never came. I looked at him, but did not offer one of those sentences people use when they want grief to become easier. Grant did not seem to need easier. He needed someone willing to understand why this room mattered. So after he died, you stayed to finish it. That was the idea. Your brother did not want to. Grant shook his head. Mark loved Dad, but he had already built a life in Oregon. He saw the farm as property we could sell and divide. I saw. He paused. I saw this. He gestured toward the map. Did you buy a share? Eventually. That must have been expensive. It was. His answer was short enough to tell me not to follow that road yet. I walked closer to the map. A handwritten sentence appeared near the bottom, beneath several proposed acres of wildflowers. Leave enough blooming for whatever comes next. Your father wrote that? Yeah. Grant smiled faintly. He liked sentences that sounded wiser than they probably were. I think that one earns it. For the first time since entering the room, Grant laughed. Then his expression softened. After the funeral, I could not come in here. I locked the door because every unfinished box felt like proof that he was supposed to come back. I understood that more than I wanted to. My own method for dealing with things I could not change had always been distance. New city, new assignment, new hotel. Grant had done the opposite. He had stayed within a few hundred feet of the place he could barely enter. Why show me now? I asked. He leaned against the workbench. Because you stopped asking. That seems backward. Most people ask questions because they want answers. You stopped. Because you realized I was not ready to give one. I looked down at my camera. Occupational growth. Maybe. Grant glanced at it. You can photograph the room. I looked up. Are you sure? The map. The notebooks. The workbench. He hesitated. Not the family photographs. Understood. I raised the camera slowly. Through the viewfinder, the room stopped looking like a collection of abandoned objects. It became evidence of an unfinished intention. Grant remained outside every frame, but his presence was everywhere. In the repaired hive boxes. In the fresh seed packets mixed among the old ones. In the newer handwriting beside his father's notes. When I lowered the camera, I noticed something I had missed before. Several sections of the map had recent dates beside them. You have been following his plan. Grant nodded. For 5 years. How much have you finished? About 40 acres. I stared at him. By yourself? Not entirely. I hire help when I can. Grant, that is not maintaining a few beehives. That is rebuilding an ecosystem. He looked almost uncomfortable with the description. I am finishing what he started. That is a big difference. Maybe. I turned toward the map again. Suddenly the farm looked different in my mind. The tall grass was not neglect everywhere. Some of it was transition. The wildflowers were not decoration. The hives were not simply a business. So this is why you stayed? I said. Grant was silent long enough that I turned back toward him. His expression told me I had reached the wrong conclusion. It is why I stayed at first, he said. What does that mean? He looked at the map, then at the notebook in his hand. It means you still think the secret is that I am trying to save this farm. Are you not? Grant closed the notebook and placed it carefully on the bench. Dylan, I am not saving it so I can keep it. The room went quiet. Then who are you saving it for? Grant looked toward the fields beyond the window, where the last light was disappearing over the hives. That is the part one have not told you yet. Grant did not explain the rest that night. He closed the workshop, locked the door, and walked me back across the yard as if he had not just rewritten everything I thought I understood about him. The next morning, however, he was waiting on the porch with 2 coffees and a thick folder beside his chair. I assume that is not light reading, I said. Probably not. I sat beside him. Grant pushed the folder toward me. The first page showed a map of the property divided into several sections. Beneath it were documents from a regional conservation trust, habitat surveys, proposed easements, and a timeline stretching across the next year. I have been working with them for almost 2 years, Grant said. If everything goes through, most of the farm becomes protected land. I looked at him. Protected how? No commercial development. No subdivision. The fields stay habitat. The trust manages the restoration long-term. And you still own it. Grant shook his head. Not most of it. I looked back at the documents. You are giving the land away? Transferring it under the agreement. Grant, this is hundreds of acres. 218. That is not a small donation. I know. I turned another page, trying to understand the scale of what he was showing me. Your brother agreed to this? I bought his share 3 years ago. With what? Grant gave me a tired smile. Savings. Investments. I sold a rental property my parents left us. Took out a loan for part of it. I stared at him. You bought the farm so you could give most of it away? That sounds irresponsible when you say it like that. I am struggling to find the responsible version. Grant looked toward the wildflower field. If I sold to a developer, I would walk away with more money than I will probably earn in years. But Dad spent half his life talking about what this land could become. I decided that mattered more to me. Does the trust know what you have put into this? Yes. Does anyone else? A few people. Suddenly his refusal to be photographed made more sense. Grant had not built his life around being recognized for what he was doing. He had quietly spent years making sure the work could continue without him. What happens to the hives? I asked. I keep the apiary and a smaller section around the farmhouse and barn. The trust wants the bees incorporated into the education program eventually. So you will stay here. Grant did not answer. I turned toward him. You are staying, right? I do not know. That answer bothered me more than I expected. You have spent 5 years rebuilding this place. That does not mean I have to live here forever. Then where would you go? Grant stared into his coffee. That is the problem. You do not know? I never planned that far. He leaned back in the chair. After Dad died, there was always another thing that needed doing. Why mark out? Restore another field. Expand the hives. Meet with the trust. Find funding. Finish paperwork. Every year had a purpose. And after the transfer, the purpose belongs to someone else. There was no self-pity in his voice. That made the words harder to hear. What do you want? I asked. Grant gave a quiet laugh. I have spent 5 years figuring out how to save this place. I never figured out how to save a place for myself. The sentence stayed between us. I thought about my Chicago apartment with its half-empty closets. My suitcase that rarely made it into storage. The assignments waiting in Minnesota and beyond. I had always believed Grant and I were opposites. He stayed. I left. He belonged to one place. I belonged everywhere. Sitting there, I suddenly understood that neither of those things was true. Grant had made himself useful enough that he never had to decide what he wanted after the work was finished. I had made myself mobile enough that I never had to decide where I wanted to belong. He had hidden inside responsibility. I had hidden inside freedom. That is why you asked what I was running from, I said. Grant looked at me. Maybe. Because you recognized it. I recognized someone who always had somewhere else to be. I smiled faintly. Minnesota is probably filing a missing person report. You should go. The words landed harder than they should have. You want me to leave? That is not what I said. It sounded remarkably similar. Grant set his coffee down. You have work, Dylan. A life. I do not want this place becoming another excuse not to deal with whatever is waiting for you. What if I am not avoiding something? Then what are you doing here? I opened my mouth and realized I did not have a clean answer. The farm was beautiful. The photography was good. But none of that explained why I knew how Grant took his coffee, why I noticed when he smiled, or why the possibility of leaving suddenly felt less like freedom. I looked across the porch at him. Maybe I am trying to figure that out. Grant held my gaze for a moment, then nodded. Later that afternoon, I stood in the west field photographing the hives while Grant worked several yards away. For the first time since arriving, I turned the camera toward him. I did not press the shutter. Grant noticed anyway. Still no photographs of me, he called. I lowered the camera. I remember. He returned to the hive. Then, after a few seconds, he looked back. Maybe someday. I smiled. I can wait. A week earlier, those words would have sounded impossible coming from me. Now, standing completely still while bees moved through the flowers around us, waiting was beginning to feel less like losing time and more like finally paying attention. 3 mornings later, Grant surprised me by standing in the west field without his beekeeper veil and saying, "All right, take the picture." I nearly lowered my camera. Are you serious? Before I change my mind. That gives me tremendous artistic freedom. You have 30 seconds. I smiled and raised the camera. Grant stood between the hives with wildflowers reaching almost to his knees, morning light catching the edges of his brown hair. I had photographed hundreds of people during assignments, but this felt different because I knew what existed outside the frame. I knew the farmhouse behind him held his father's unfinished plans. I knew the fields represented 5 years of work. I knew the man looking toward my lens had spent so long protecting a future for the land that he had forgotten to imagine one for himself. I pressed the shutter once. That is it? Grant asked. That is it. You usually take 50 pictures of a fence post. Fence posts are difficult subjects. He walked over and looked at the screen. For several seconds, he said nothing. I looked tired. You look real. Grant glanced at me. Is that photographer language for tired? It means I would not change anything. His eyes stayed on mine a second longer than necessary before he looked back at the photograph. That afternoon, I sat at the porch table editing the images I had taken since arriving. What began as a collection of rural photographs had become a story without me realizing it. The empty farmhouse. The restored wildflowers. Grant's hands checking a hive frame. His father's notebooks. The conservation map. And now Grant himself standing in the middle of everything he had chosen to protect. You should tell people, I said. Grant looked up from repairing a wooden hive box. Tell people what? The whole story. Why? Because people care about things when they understand what is at stake. He shook his head. I do not need attention. This is not about attention. The trust needs support. You said restoration takes money, volunteers, equipment. They have fundraising people. They do not have this. I turned my laptop toward him. Grant studied the photographs. A photo essay? A real one. I could pitch it to a regional magazine. Maybe conservation publications too. And suddenly, I become the lonely beekeeper saving his father's farm? No. I closed the laptop halfway. Not unless that is how you want the story told. Grant leaned back. How would you tell it? I thought carefully before answering. A man inherited a choice. He could turn land into money, or turn it into something that would outlast him. He chose the second option. Grant looked toward the fields. You make it sound noble. I would also include the part where you insult visiting photographers. For balance. Journalistic integrity. He smiled, then became serious again. Why does this matter so much to you? That question had followed me since our conversation on the porch. This time, I had an answer. Because I think I finally understand what you saw in this place. And what is that? Something worth staying long enough to help. Grant went quiet. I expected him to retreat from the conversation, but instead he said, You told me. You have been traveling almost constantly for 6 years. About that. How many places have you photographed? I stopped counting. How many people actually know you? I frowned. That is an unfair question. Probably. What does it have to do with the photo essay? Grant walked closer and rested one hand on the back of the chair opposite mine. You want people to see me because you think I have been hiding behind this farm. Have you not? Absolutely. His honesty caught me off guard. But you hide too, Dylan. You just do it at 60 miles an hour. I laughed quietly. That sounds like something your father would have written on the map. He would have made it longer. Grant looked at the laptop, then at me. I will do the photo essay. Really? On one condition. Here it comes. If you are going to ask me to let people see what I chose to protect, then you have to let someone see you too. I did not joke this time. Meaning what? Meaning stop giving me the version of yourself you give people you meet on the road. The funny photographer who is leaving next week. His voice softened. Tell me why you never call anywhere home. The request felt more intimate than anything either of us had said. I looked across the fields, searching for an easy answer and finding none. Because every time I stayed somewhere long enough to build a life, I started wondering whether there was something better waiting somewhere else. Eventually, leaving became easier than choosing. Grant nodded as if that confirmed something. And now I am starting to wonder whether constantly keeping my options open is the same thing as never choosing anything. The wind moved through the wildflowers. Grant sat beside me. Our shoulders nearly touched, but neither of us moved closer. That sounds uncomfortable, he said. Extremely. Good. I looked at him. Good. You have been comfortable running for years. I smiled. You really need to work on encouragement. I keep bees. They respond poorly to motivational speeches. I laughed, and Grant did too. Then he nodded toward my laptop. Send the pitch. Tonight. Before I change my mind. I opened the screen again. Grant stayed beside me while I selected photographs and began drafting the proposal. For years, my camera had been a way to arrive somewhere, capture what interested me, and leave. That evening, for the first time, it became a reason to remain. And when Grant's shoulder finally rested lightly against mine while we reviewed the photographs, I understood that the story I was trying to tell was no longer only about a farm finding a future. Somewhere along the way, two men who had become very good at hiding were beginning to let themselves be seen. The magazine answered 4 days later, and by lunchtime Grant had read the email 3 times without admitting he was impressed. They want the full photo essay, I said, sitting across from him on the farmhouse porch. I can read. You have been staring at the screen for 10 minutes. I am making sure there is not a catch. There is. You have to let me photograph you again. Grant handed my phone back. I knew this was a mistake. I laughed, but the response mattered more than either of us wanted to say. The editor wanted photographs of the restoration, the hives, Grant working, and the history behind the conservation project. More importantly, the magazine planned to publish information about the trust and ways readers could support the sanctuary. Within 2 weeks, the first online version appeared. Messages followed. A local gardening club offered volunteers. A native plant nursery promised seedlings for spring. A regional conservation organization contacted the trust about possible funding. Grant stood beside me in the barn reading one email after another. This is strange, he said. Good strange. I am not used to people offering help before I ask. Maybe you should practice. I thought you were the one learning new habits. We can both be projects. Grant looked at me and smiled. By then, I had been at the same motel for almost a month. My Minnesota assignment had been rearranged, then completed in a shorter 3-day trip. The surprising part was not that I left Wisconsin. It was that, for the first time in years, I knew exactly where I wanted to return afterward. Grant was waiting near the hives when I drove back. He did not say he had missed me. He handed me coffee and said, "You took long enough." Somehow that said more. 2 days later, another email arrived. This one was for me. A travel publication wanted me for a 6-month assignment covering small communities across the western United States. The pay was excellent. The work was exactly the kind of opportunity one had spent years building toward. 6 months earlier, I would have accepted before finishing the first paragraph. Instead, I stared at the message until Grant noticed. What happened? We were sitting on the porch after sunset. I handed him my phone. He read the offer and gave it back. That is big. Yeah. You should take it. The answer came so quickly that I felt something tighten in my chest. That was easy. Grant frowned. What do you mean? Nothing. Dylan. I stood and walked toward the railing. I thought you might at least pretend the idea of me disappearing for 6 months bothered you. Grant was quiet behind me. It does. I turned. Then why tell me to go? Because I am not going to become another reason you avoid making your own decision. Maybe staying would be my decision. Then make it because you want the life that comes with staying, not because you are afraid of losing whatever this is." He gestured gently between us. Neither of us had named it yet. We had shared coffees, long conversations, quiet evenings, and moments that lasted slightly longer than friendship required. But Grant was right. If I stayed only because I wanted to keep him close, I would eventually wonder what I had sacrificed. "And if I leave?" I asked. His expression softened. "Then leave because you want that life. Not because leaving is what you always do." I looked toward the dark field. Somewhere beyond the porch light, thousands of bees were settled inside their hives. Grant came to stand beside me. "You taught me something too," he said. "What?" "Finishing my father's plan does not mean my life has to end where his did. I can keep the apiary. I can help the trust. I can even fix that ridiculous farmhouse someday." "It is not ridiculous." "The kitchen floor disagrees." I smiled. Grant continued. "But I need to decide what I want after the project is finished. You need to decide what you want when there is no next destination telling you where to go." That night, I returned to the motel and opened the assignment email again. I imagined 6 months of highways, hotel rooms, rental cars, photographs, and stories. I knew I would enjoy parts of it. I also imagined returning to Chicago afterward, placing another hard drive on a shelf, and wondering where I was supposed to go next. Then I remembered the first morning Grant brought me near the hives. Every instinct had told me to move when the bees came close. His instruction had been simple: stand still. I had mistaken stillness for danger because movement was the only thing that made me feel in control. The next morning, I called the editor. I declined the 6-month assignment and offered an alternative: shorter projects I could complete in 2 or 3 weeks at a time. To my surprise, they agreed to discuss it. I drove to the farm afterward. Grant was repairing a hive box in the barn. "I turned it down," I said. "He stopped working." "Because of me?" "No." The answer felt important. "Because I do not want to spend 6 months living out of a suitcase anymore. I still want to travel. I still want the work. I just want somewhere to come back to." Grant studied me carefully. "Chicago?" "I do not know yet." I stepped closer. "That is the first decision I want to make without running." Grant's expression softened into the quiet smile I had learned to recognize. "What happens now?" he asked. I looked toward the open barn doors, the farmhouse beyond them, and the fields beginning to glow beneath the morning sun. Now I stay still long enough to find out. 6 months later, I came back from a 3-day photography assignment in Michigan and found Grant standing exactly where I had first seen him, between the west hives with morning sunlight across the wildflowers. The difference was that nothing around him looked abandoned anymore. The conservation agreement had been finalized in early spring. Most of the 218 acres were now protected through the trust, and volunteers had helped plant additional native flowers along the restored fields. Grant still managed the apiary, but he no longer carried every responsibility alone. The farmhouse had changed too. We had repaired the porch, replaced several windows, and made the kitchen usable again. Grant had finally moved out of the cabin and into the house. I had not. That distinction mattered to both of us. Instead, I rented the renovated room above the barn and turned half of it into a photography studio. I still had my Chicago apartment for the moment, but I spent more time here than there. We had decided not to confuse choosing each other with rushing into every possible next step. "You are late," Grant called when I crossed the field. I checked my watch. "By what standard?" "Mine. That is not legally recognized." Grant smiled. "How was Michigan?" "Cold. Beautiful. I took 800 photographs of a shoreline." "Only 800. I demonstrated restraint. I set my bag beside a fence post and looked around. "Everything okay here?" "The bees survived 3 days without your supervision." "Impressive." I struggled. "That I believe." Grant laughed and returned to the open hive. I pulled on the spare veil he kept for me and walked closer. 6 months earlier, I would have been calculating how quickly I could step backward if a bee approached. Now the sound felt familiar. A bee landed on my sleeve. I looked down at it and did nothing. Grant noticed. "Look at you." "What?" "No panic." "I never panicked." "You once stopped breathing." "That story has been exaggerated." We waited until the bee lifted away. Grant closed the hive and looked at me. "Stand still." "I'm standing still." "I know." Something in the way he said it made me smile. He stepped closer and brushed a small piece of grass from my shoulder. The gesture was ordinary, but ordinary had become my favorite thing about us. Our first kiss had happened months earlier on the farmhouse porch after a long conversation about whether either of us was actually ready for a relationship. Nothing dramatic had followed. No promises about forever. No instant merging of lives. Just dinner the next evening, coffee the morning after that, and hundreds of small choices. That slowly became a life. I brought you something, I said. I opened my camera bag and handed him a printed photograph. Grant studied it. It was the first portrait I had taken of him in the West Field. You already gave me this. Turn it over. He did. On the back, I had written the date and one sentence. The place where I finally stopped running. Grant read it twice. That is dangerously sentimental for you. Do not tell anyone. Your reputation is safe. We walked toward the farmhouse together. Near the barn, a new wooden sign identified the protected land and its pollinator restoration project. Grant slowed whenever he passed it. I knew why. His father's dream had survived, but it no longer required Grant to sacrifice every part of himself to keep it alive. The trust called yesterday, he said. They want me to lead 2 workshops this fall. You should. I said yes. I looked at him, without spending 3 weeks thinking about it. Personal growth. I am proud of you. Grant glanced at me. Careful. More sentiment. At the porch, I set down my camera bag. Through the open farmhouse windows came the smell of fresh coffee. The house that once seemed frozen in another decade now had books on the tables, clean curtains, repaired floors, and muddy work boots beside the door. It was not finished. Neither were we. That felt right. I have another assignment next month, I said. Colorado. 12 days. Grant nodded. Sounds good. You are supposed to pretend you will miss me. I will miss you. He said it without hesitation now. 6 months had changed that too. But you are coming back. I looked at him. Yeah, I am. Grant leaned against the porch railing. You know what is strange? When you first showed up, I thought you were just another photographer passing through. I was. What changed? I looked across the restored field, then toward the barn studio, the hives, and finally him. I used to think staying meant getting stuck. Grant waited. And now? I smiled. Now I think it means having somewhere worth coming back to. Grant reached for my hand. I stepped closer, and we shared a gentle kiss beneath the morning light before walking inside. Together, I had spent years collecting photographs of places I would never see twice, convinced freedom meant always having another road ahead of me. Grant had spent years protecting one piece of land without asking whether he deserved a future beyond it. Neither of us rescued the other. He taught me how to stand still, and I reminded him that staying did not require standing alone. On the kitchen counter sat 2 coffee mugs and a fresh jar of honey. Outside, the bees moved through fields that would remain protected long after us. For the first time in my adult life, my suitcase was still packed upstairs. Another assignment was already waiting, and I felt no need to wonder where I belonged. I finally had somewhere I wanted to return to.